Hello, North Dakota Beekeepers. Again, this is Jay Evans, coming to you not live on September 30th, 2025, and very much hoping to talk to you at some point about beekeeping and science, and very appreciative of many of you for your inspiration and support, and to John Miller for the invitation and your committee. Truly wish I could be there in person, but I will send a virtual hello in the form of this talk, and I very much hope to keep in touch in the next year. So I'll get out there at some point, I hope. So I've been charged with talking about USDA bee research more broadly, and I will attempt to do that. I will borrow from some slides from our national program leader, Kevin Hackett, and Arathi Seshrati, who's helping him currently to envision how USDA pollinator science can address issues of beekeepers. And so many of the slides will be from that effort. And then I'll throw in some stuff that I feel will be important, and is bearing results for research right now. So I'm very, very happy to get a chance to discuss this topic with all of you. And it's an open discussion, so please do get in touch with your thoughts, suggestions on what would be a priority for beekeepers, and how to make that vital industry out there in North Dakota and elsewhere sustainable, how to keep you all in business. Okay, so and this is a talk that most of you will know, and many of you are commercial beekeepers. Certainly, the importance of bees for U.S. agriculture is immense. In the interesting foods we eat, the nutritional and flavorful foods depend on bee pollination, and that's a huge economic industry. California almond production is immense. The acreage for California almonds has continued to increase, and very much relies on bees at the moment, and even in the future, it looks like there will always be a need for honeybee pollination of almonds, and dozens of other crops in the U.S. The beekeeper gets a bit of that cut for these highly profitable crops, and that I know helps sustain your industry while providing this great service. The almond production boom from 2025 was predicted to be slightly higher than 2024, as the acreage is also increasing. So again, this is an industry that's important for the country. It's also important for beekeepers, and beekeepers are doing a great service by themselves supporting this nutritious crop. Okay, so I talked a little bit about this in the last talk that I did for your meeting, but I wanted to highlight a couple things. Again, the main actors the threats, as it were, are the climate and drought, especially chemicals in the environment. Oops. Diseases, and I put goats up there instead of random acts of nature because random acts of nature wouldn't fit in that little box, and goats are as chaotic as I've ever seen for an animal. So it's things that come about and can impact your operations in an unpredictable way. Flooding, droughts, bears, things like that. So I also wanted to divvy up some of and these are not fixed differences by any means, but just sort of the different characters of beekeepers versus scientists in addressing these problems. And you as beekeepers have obviously the primary role. You choose the stocks of bees that you maintain. You choose where to position them. I'll talk a little bit at the end about, tools that are coming online to help you position your bees. You monitor them often with the help of inspectors like Samantha Brunner and others who can help you monitor disease and monitor other threats to your bees. And of course, you mitigate those threats, right? You get out there and decide when an apiary is just not working for whatever reason. It could be nutrition, it could be chemical stress, could be crowdedness from an adjacent beekeeper. And sadly, a lot of what beekeepers do also is to replace bees that have failed, colonies that have failed, either by splitting or purchasing, and kind of recouping losses is unfortunately part of your business model to survive in this industry. Um, on the scientist side, I put genetics up here as one of the tools scientists are lucky enough to have that are, it's an expensive tool that beekeepers, it's hard enough to be a farmer, to be a beekeeper, and you're not going to run a genetics lab on the side of that. It's expensive for the equipment and everything. So scientists at universities and the USDA can help with things like genetic markers for breeding traits and certainly genetic traits of disease agents. We also tend to specialize into ologies like pathology, toxicology, pharmacology, ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. So there is expertise in the scientist world in part because people often spend many years zeroed in on a very perhaps narrow branch of beekeeping, but that gives them just insights by that focus over time. Scientists, I would argue, also can bust myths. They tend not to have a lot of economic stake in the outcomes of their work. I know it's really is true that scientists certainly benefit from things like grants and that, but their livelihoods are often determined by institutions. And so I would say scientists by and large are able to tackle questions and in an impartial way and sort of see what the truth is. That's what science is. Try to sort out in a complicated world some of the truths. Scientists also translate a lot of things by meeting with beekeepers, and that's why it's doubly unfortunate, in my view, to not get to meetings because we learn a ton from beekeepers. We also learn a ton from our colleagues, and so we translate things between the two as part of our jobs. Okay, so again, like the last talk, I have to start with the problem. And then I'd like to again talk about, sort of ways to approach the problem and also the USDA efforts that are aimed at addressing bee challenges, the challenges that you face as beekeepers. Okay, so what's the problem? This is the problem. It's just darned hard to keep bees alive these days. And this is um this is for commercial beekeepers. And, I've met enough commercial beekeepers that I know you know how to keep bees alive. You've had training, you've had generational training sometimes. You talk a lot, you share a lot. So when even given that sort of, the NFL level um, skill set of that's required to run a business as a beekeeper, the losses mount up and they're 40% and as I've shown a little bit over 50% now for commercial beekeepers. And that's just really hard to cope with as you're running your business. Okay, and this is from this survey with Pam and the ABF from this early spring, churning through the numbers, and there are multiple reasons to do surveys. One is to see if there is something to sort of the alarms raised by certain beekeepers. And then, of course, there's also the need to try to seek solutions when you have these events. In the short term, really, these surveys started to document the losses, to start churning the wheels, perhaps for government support for beekeepers who were facing heavy and unexpected losses as they were this year. And then the rest of the time, as it were, has been devoted to looking for clues, looking for something in those losses that might actually be a tool that we could use to feedback to beekeepers, or beekeepers could read and say, aha, that's what I needed to do this year and I didn't do it, or vice versa. So those are the rationales for these sorts of triage surveys. There's some great permanent surveys for beekeeping. The US Bee Health Survey continues and will be annual uh, for some time, which is fantastic. Also, the USDA NAS survey, you really are encouraged to fill that out. And that's the most sort of systematic survey. It's been run by statistical experts for decades. And so both the questioning and the persistence. If you've ever I've had a hobby farm, and even there, if we have chickens or we report a couple beehives, they will not let you rest until you give your answer for what happened to your small or large flock the previous year. So the USDA NAS survey is hugely important, and many of you, I'm sure, are taking part in that. This survey was more ad hoc, chatting as things started to look bad, with Danielle Downey at PAM, and Debbie Seib and Patty Sundberg at ABF. It was apparent that it was really important to kind of get a beat on what was going on and if this was a widespread issue for beekeepers, which we think it was. And it certainly was geographically widespread, right? So we've got here the survey broken down into regions. You all are, right up here in these sort of the high plains, traditionally great beekeeping terrain, at least in the Dakotas and Montana, and also, great honey production areas, of course. Um, the losses for commercial beekeepers were about the same in your neck of the woods as they were across the country. Maybe a little bit higher, this lighter color for sideliner beekeepers. Um, we don't really have a lot of hobbyists reporting back from either the sideliners or a lot of beekeepers in the hobbyist or sideliner categories for your area. So I wouldn't know, I wouldn't take that super seriously. But it was apparent that beekeepers across the country, many of them were having a really rough year. Their losses were, the greenish here is above 50%. So these sort of light green, lime green losses are 60 plus percent. These are actually 60% for the commercial beekeepers in your area. So the losses were incredibly high. Puzzling losses that were super high. Um, we asked the beekeepers who responded to this survey what they perceived as potential drivers for these losses. For all three classes, Varroa was predominant. For commercial beekeepers, pesticides were a pretty close second. Um, the sideliners and hobbyists cited queen failure more often, maybe due to different management strategies for queens and replacing queens. But everybody recognized Varroa, and pesticides were also, often prevalent, especially for the commercial beekeepers. I spoke in the earlier talk, and we've been thinking a lot, and especially colleagues smarter in this field, about how best to treat Varroa. And we do feel, I think there's a consensus that Amitraz it's been a long-standing and strong treatment, but is losing its luster, as it were, in parts of the country, and might yeah it's a trend of chemicals that they either need to be rotated around with different chemicals, or eventually, unfortunately, they will lose some of their activity. However, beekeepers who did not use Amitraz also suffered pretty high losses, and this is again especially commercial beekeepers. Many commercial beekeepers use Amitraz. as a treatment for mites. It's a long-standing effective treatment. Um, but there are some who don't use amitraz at all, and they also suffered pretty high losses this year. So um, hard hard to blame it on one avenue for treating mites. That doesn't mean we can't blame it on the mites because mites certainly are a problem, and there's documented evidence that mite levels are important for bee health. Um, I show this slide in my prior talk for your group, and I just look at it again and again, partly because it's just heartbreaking. These are again responses from beekeepers, commercial beekeepers on the left, who had variable levels of loss and just sort of getting a bead on their financial concern or financial stress from 0 to 10. And a lot of beekeepers are in this 10. This is basically like a pain scale. This would be your leg is falling off sort of pain. A lot of stress from all of this in your businesses, and especially as the loss rates for those, each of these dots is one operation. As the loss rates go up, that financial pain and worry is also going up in a straight line. Again, this is different from our other stakeholders who are a little more buffered. Not that they love their bees any less, but they're not, their mortgages don't depend on their bee productivity, or their fuel costs or tractors and everything. So this is really striking, and it was, I think, one of the important things to come out of this survey is kind of documenting this sort of sociological cost, economic cost to beekeepers. Okay, so now a little shift back towards research, trying to think of ways, creative ways maybe that we can address this, not just use the same old techniques and thoughts. There's a concept for human health called One Health. It's basically holistic health, but with modern tools, doesn't shy away from technology, of course. And this is viable for beekeeping. We all want healthier bees. That leads to better crop pollination, healthy crops that provide safe pollen, as does almonds by and large. They will lead back to bee health. Those crops certainly lead economically to supporting beekeeper livelihoods, and are important that way. Honey and hive products, especially North Dakota, are a big part of the game still, and healthy bees can produce more honey. And of course, that is an economic driver for beekeepers to keep you all in the business. So what can you do within this system to kind of keep everything churning, to keep this arrow thick where the bees are around to help pollinators, and then this arrow where that's an economic driver back to beekeepers. First, you need workable bees, good breeds of bees, healthy queens that are well mated, and management solutions, which can be, we stress mite control a lot, or mite monitoring. There are other forms of management, certainly the timing of moving bees. And this feeds into the next topic, which is, when do you get your bees out of a place and into a different habitat? And is that habitat still as productive as it used to be? Is it suitable for your bees? There's a lot of really kind of neat technology on this, and we're all immersed with adverts for AI and for technology, but there are some good tools coming online. I'll talk about one of them that's a modeling tool. There are monitoring tools for beehives and apiaries as well. So technology is part of One Health in that it can give you a little boost in keeping your bees happy. Again, thinking at the factory level, all of those tools feed into a kind of a holistic view of your beehives. Okay, so what's USDA ARS doing about all this? And I will say we work with our university colleagues pretty extensively, and and everybody's in the same game. If they're doing applied bee research of looking for avenues to help short and long term to help beekeepers. There's been a lot of soul searching at USDA. Partly just this year, there's been sort of the development of a roadmap, a sort of a futuristic look at how to improve bee research and make it more and make it address bee problems. And those problems again can be from treatment of disease, healthy forage, queen or productivity health, and then just understanding all the bad guys, all the bad actors in the hive. These are sort of four broad categories of ARS research that are getting a lot of attention and getting a lot of collaboration across labs. Certainly disease intervention, using technologies to identify disease, working with the apiary inspectors to identify disease and to identify trends in disease is hugely important. Right up there with you all monitoring mites and other signs of disease in your colonies. We're of course interested in new treatments. It's one thing to know you've got a bad thing going on, but if you can't treat it, it's less useful information. So treating that, also watching out for emergent threats. Tropholaelapse, of course, comes up a lot as a disease, but there's viruses. We know at least one virus that simply wasn't in the U.S. Well, now it's been almost 20 years, 18 years, but it got here and it's now the predominant virus in beehives. So there are changes when a new parasite or pathogen comes on the scene. Um, there's also a lot of work on diverse pollinators in USDA, and on pollinators getting along well and coping with each other. And I think generally speaking, that's the case that if that good forage, lifts up all bees and is far more important than negative interactions between bees. There's a lot of breeding efforts in USDA. There's now a so-called pangenome, which is basically deep looks at the genomes of all the key trait lineages of bees, named things like Russian bees or the Hilo bee, but also, just kind of identifying key genes or families of genes that can be used for breeding. This has been a long-standing effort of breeding to use genetics more directly, and it's starting to pay off, I would argue, where bee breeders working with researchers can identify traits for hygienic behavior, especially, which has a great history of genetic breeding, and speed up that search. And then on environmental stress, there's been efforts to understand the effects of climate and drought on bee health, uh, managing forage consequently for that. Of course, looking at overwintering patterns and changes in the overwintering patterns of bees, and then finally pesticide exposure, which is ever present for bees and something to think about. So in the ARS, there's actually a lot of pockets of bee research. Fargo here in North Dakota, um, Morris, Minnesota, Brookings, South Dakota, and Sydney, Montana are all, kind of working on aspects of bee health, especially in terms of forage and such. The historical bee labs are in yellow. Logan, of course, has worked on other bees as well as honeybees. Davis, Tucson, Stoneville, Baton Rouge, now Peoria, a very new player in the game, and us out in Beltsville, all focused on honeybee health in particular. This is a sort of a word summary of the labs, the primary or regional labs in Baton Rouge and Beltsville. Davis is relatively new and doing great work on queen health and some pest control. Logan is primarily the all other pollinators. Peoria, Illinois has just gotten funding to look at microbes in bees. Stoneville is doing really nice work on pesticides, nutrition, and general bee health. Some new scientists there are doing great work. And then Tucson historically has worked on honeybee nutrition, but also is working on monitoring and disease. And then these labs are have individual scientists often who are interested in helping out in the bee problems. So, what would you do if you had the purse strings or the planning for a large research program like this? This is the schematic that Kevin Hackett and Arathi Sashrati came up with to sustain healthy bees. And so many of these players we've all talked about for many years, pests and disease, monitoring colony performance, breeding and genetics, pesticides, nutrition, how to manage nutrition and supplement it if you have to. And then finally, queen health and drone health, reproductive health of bees. So these are the key factors that lead to healthier bee colonies. Unfortunately, there are also the goats, the random events that happen. Tropolapse would be a big one. New viruses we think are big ones. Nosema cerani was a big one. These are all events that came into beekeeping unsuspecting to scientists, to beekeepers, and caused a big problem. Okay, right now, this year, given the losses, we're involved with what's called a rapid egg crisis response. The collections that I've talked about are part of that. Looking at Varroa to see how widespread resistance is and what other treatments might work, pushing other treatments to regulation. Um, a lot of work now on hive sensors, monitoring. There's a lot of companies vying for your dollars and time. And there's research that's aiming to study that, try to see what's going on there. Oops. Um, Certainly, there's been a lot of work on sampling this year. If and when we're open, there will be some ARS colleagues, Michael Simone Finstrom, coming out at the end of this week to start sampling, and we're all interested in sort of sharing samples and adding our own expertise to samples from critical beekeepers like those in your area. Um, so there's diversity of efforts. This rapid response is focused on Varroa and viruses, but we have a lot of work going on now on chemical stress, I'd say more than ever, and also on nutritional, you know, improving the nutritional status of bees. But Varroa, several researchers are looking at new treatments for Varroa, trying to sort out miticides, get them through the regulatory pathway. So you should have more choices soon. There's certainly been sort of reinventions of oxalic acid as one example with different delivery methods. And that I think is a very big positive to give you more options. Um, Virus is vectored by mites, and I did not write this slide, but of course I would have voted for it in a way. I think getting either the mites or the viruses out of the system and targeting them both is essential. I think we can target viruses uh, on top of targeting mites. I think we have some candidates for virus drugs that might help with some of that problem. But lots of diverse people working on that. On the monitoring side, there are efforts to look at uh, both the effects of holding yards on bees, nutritional stress, work with Pam and others to look at widespread colony level or sorry country level patterns. There's also a project looking at brood presence in colonies at a range of habitats across the U.S., partly with an idea to see how sustainable tropolapse might be in different regions. Tropolapse is pretty heavily dependent on brood, um, though it can find alternate ways to get through a brood dearth, but but the brood monitoring is looking at mites in general and how they might be sustained even in the winter. I wanted to highlight another project by Zach Lamas that to me was eye-opening and kind of helped direct a lot of our work. Just the fact that your mites in your colonies are not faithful to one bee. They're hopping around all over the place. Um, Unfortunately, that means they're more likely, like with any contagious disease, to pick one up and then to pass it on to a neighboring host, another bee in the colony. And this is a really nice graphic that Zach put together, basically showing that, even when the parasite burden is moderate, in this case fairly high, uh, since mites are moving B2B so quickly, the absolute parasite burden goes up many-fold. So basically, the pink bees are all secondarily exposed by mites that hopped off another bee. So there's really this sort of additive effect of being in a colony that can help disease spread. He's done some neat work with drones. Drones are attractive to mites, and there it's even more extreme. Like drones are just targeted, and it's very hard to grow up as a male bee without having some mite factor in your life, which is really hard for their health. Um, there are treatments for Varroa. The standard ones, Amitraz is still kicking. It still works in many places. But there's work to develop new miticides and new formulations of things like oxalic acid. So hopeful things there. Again, I mentioned earlier the antiviral strategies. Uh, it's just long overdue to have a true antiviral drug for honeybees. We can deliver things in so many different ways through patties or fondant or sugar syrup. There are lots of ways you could medicate your bees safely, and we just need to get better candidates that actually work and are economical and stable. But a really exciting work at in lots of places on that topic. Um, for Varroa, there's work to change behaviors, perhaps to trap mites and to move them around. Also to breed bees that affect mite vitality. Mite resistant bees are a thing. They work. They are able to keep mite levels down, and we think that consequently leads to less virus disease. So a lot of work to try to understand those mechanisms and to really maintain them in an honest way in breeding populations. So for the crisis monitoring and surveys, every time there's a die-off event, maybe not every county of every state, but with commercial die-offs, we're going to try to have these sort of standard methodologies. For analyzing samples for viruses and mites, and trying to get diagnoses earlier in the season. And that's one reason we kind of rushed out the work from this spring with Varroa and viruses is we wanted that news out there so beekeepers would at least consider other treatments for mites. That was the primary reason to kind of to fast track that particular study is no to get it out there to give you a hint with your own mite counts that of what one major factor could be of bee losses. Um, there's a lot of work on kind of physiological stress, and this can be pesticides, it can be movement of bees, but temperature stress in bees. And also just trying to sort out how to manage them better thanks to technology. So how do you monitor hives in sheds? How do you monitor them on trucks or holding yards or places where they might be a little bit stressed? There are great tools, cheaper and cheaper tools for doing that, and researchers who are happy to help with that and to help think about that. On the forage side, sorting out when flowers are flowering, if things are changing, matching bees to crops that are safe and nutritious, and simply figuring out how to get that, how to feed the factory in an optimal way. And then finally, pollen and honey samples for contaminants, and these can be heavy metals, or pesticides, and then also the sort of nutritional components that some pollens are not quite as nutritious as others. A lot of work there, a lot of new technologies. It's still very expensive to check samples for pesticides, as many of you know. So that needs to come down a bit to be sort of viable at the action level for beekeepers. I talked about this a little bit before, but I just wanted to highlight again that there's increasingly good data on how different chemicals affect bees. The ones that are by design highly toxic to bees are present at levels that are worrisome. And again, I say this as a disease person who has spent much of my life studying viruses, but I believe the data that there are threats that are important for beekeeping and need to be monitored. You can't avoid crops in many cases, so this is a communication challenge with growers. It's also, you know, at some point, way out of my field, but it's a regulatory challenge as well to sort out, how to maintain healthy foods and crop production without dire harm to the beekeeping industry. And there's a lot of, again, technologies for this to measure them, and a lot of thought going into like what are the real risks and how bad are they really for beekeepers in different parts of the country. Um, a lot of work on forage in general, and supplements. Miguel Corona in our lab is interested for a long time in sort of amino acid supplements. There's been some really cool work on sterols, which are another component of pollens that's essential for food for bee health. So, and that and I would say on the residue side, there's two scientists in the Stoneville USDA lab who are interested in these sort of abiotic stress, and Pierre Lau, who's in the bottom right, is integrating that work with bee nutrition. So how best to feed your bees to get through winter um, without facing a lot of chemical stress. And finally, this site is not a USDA site, but I've been a fan of it for a while. It started at Penn State. And it's at the point, maybe more so for some of the eastern states right now, but you can leverage data from this site to know if your apiary site is predicted to be good or less good for beekeeping. So you can basically map out the local inputs like flowering plants and the local threats, such as documented uses of pesticides. So it's a really neat site. I think it's a good combination of research on the impacts of some of these stresses and a public site that's available to beekeepers. Um, so I will end there. And again, this is the slide I had in the other talk. Just if you're curious about some of the work at USDA, there's a pollinators landing page that's really useful. And if you're interested in sort of essays by scientists about bees and science, both American Bee Journal and Bee Culture have such writings, and I have one in Bee Culture called Bees Found in Translation. So very sorry to miss the meeting, and I'm sure you'll have a great time catching up with all of your friends and colleagues. And thank you for your time, and hope to see you all soon.